Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. We're going to be live in a major trial. We have a lot to cover. Let's break it all down. Joining me is former federal prosecutor Kendall Coffey. Kendall, great to have you back here on Law and Crime. I'm sorry this is the case that we're talking about. It is just horrific on so many levels. But as we were listening to the prosecutor delivering that closing argument, I was looking in the background of the statutory aggravating circumstances, and I couldn't help but think this jury had a big decision on their hands to weigh the aggravating versus the mitigating here. And how do you think they came to this conclusion that they felt in their hearts that this man should be put to death?
Well, I think the prosecutor was very, very effective, and he said, worst of the worst. Can you conceive of a crime that is more horrible than this one? And I think that just transcends the calculation which the jury is attempting to do. And it certainly overwhelms the argument that there was some mental illness. As we know, there are many, many people in prison who are mentally ill. Mental illness is not an excuse unless it reaches those very, very specific criteria of reason of not guilty by reason of insanity, which means that, in so many words, in most states, that the defendant actually couldn't tell whether what he was doing is right or wrong. There's no question of that here. So I think the prosecutor was very compelling, very powerful, and you leave the conclusion that if this man does not deserve the death penalty, then nobody does.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess one of the questions that I had was the defense going to get at least one juror to feel, well, you know, the Jones family, man, have they gone through so much. Do we really need to put them through another funeral, another death in the family, when all they came out and testified on behalf of the defense and they said they do not want to see this man put to death? I thought perhaps one juror might think that, but they didn't. What did you think?
Well, a lot of times that kind of testimony does as you say. You just need one to avoid the death penalty. But as the prosecution could keep coming back to the children, their faces, the things they were saying, they love their dad, and then wrap around the horrors of the way they died, him driving around 9 days, it just seemed to be, to use a prosecutor's word, if you wanted a punishment to fit the crime, there's only one punishment.
And at the end of the day, the jury is supposed to be impartial here, and they are not supposed to be swayed one way or another. And really, they made a decision that they felt was the best decision, and they can't say that it's that surprising considering what this man really did. It is horrific. But let's just continue on more with the prosecution's closing argument in the penalty phase. It was something to watch. Let's keep going. Just a fiery and emotional closing argument there by the state during the penalty phase. Kendall, one of the things that we learned yesterday is the judge, he imposed that death sentence and said that this man will be sentenced to die on November 30th. But he's not really going to be killed on November 30th, will he?
Presumably not. There are appeals. And as we know, after the appeals, there are post-conviction remedies where, for example, a condemned defendant would challenge the adequacy of his representation, say that even after he loses the appeal, he had ineffective assistance of counsel. That being said, South Carolina is one of the states that moves these cases along, perhaps among the most fastest trackways anywhere in the country. So they will have rights, again, the appeal, post-conviction relief. But this is not going to happen in November, but it's going to happen within, I would estimate, just a few years.
And if I was reading this correctly, I think South Carolina, the defendant would be able to choose his method of execution. And if I understood this correctly, South Carolina is having some trouble getting the drugs that would be needed for lethal injection. How does this all play into it?
Well, that's all been, of course, a controversy about whether the drugs create inhumane pain and suffering. And of course, in South Carolina, you got the option of the electric chair. But one of the things that defendants may do toward the end is say, I really need a lethal injection. It's such a grim thing, Jesse, to be talking about. But this is how some of these cases turn out. I
Yeah.
want lethal injection, but the chemicals are not safe, and therefore I'm challenging the means of execution until they can conclusively establish that we have humane chemical components for lethal injection. So that's another thing that comes up toward the end of these long, horrible death penalty processes.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who don't feel too much sympathy for Timothy Jones. One of the things that we noted is how much of a win this is for the prosecution. I mean, they've been at this case since 2014. Can you give us some perspective about what it feels like to not only get that successful conviction, but also to get the punishment that they were looking for, too? I mean, this must be a big moment for them.
Well, it's a huge moment, but it's a sad moment. Prosecution talent. This obvious, very talented prosecutor put a giant piece of his life into this case, along with his team. But you don't high five. The sense of accomplishment is profound, but it's an awareness of just what a loss this is for everybody. So you win a Super Bowl, everybody's excited and happy, and there's
Right.
champagne. A case like this, you're deeply satisfied, but you go home quietly, sit in the living room, maybe sip some scotch or cognac, but you're not. It's never a celebration.
Yeah, that's very well said, Kendall. And it was a conclusion to a really heart-wrenching case, one that was difficult to cover at times. And obviously, we have more to talk about with what happened yesterday. Kendall, I don't mean to be insensitive with what I'm about to say, but should the jury care what this family wants? Is that even a real consideration for them, for a man who brutally murdered his children? Don't they just have to look at these aggravating factors? And do they even consider this as mitigation?
Well, under the constitutional analysis, the jury gets to consider a broad range of issues when they decide whether life or death should be the fate for a convicted killer. So, in legal sense, they're entitled to consider it. As you know, victim impact statement, where family members of the murdered victims testify about the emotional impact on their lives of the loss, is very, very powerful. Um, I was intrigued as I was watching this case to see whether the impact of these family members could change the outcome. But the sense you get is it was too little, too late, and maybe in the minds of the jurors, entirely predictable that his family members would want him to stay alive, irrespective of how horrible a crime he committed. So it's perfectly fair, appropriate to bring this kind of testimony in. The defense thought maybe they would get one juror at least to think his life should be spared, but obviously it had a minimal impact on this jury.
Yeah, and look, I was also looking at his reaction, the defendant, because he's shown emotion only a few times throughout this trial. I'm no psychologist, psychiatrist, a body language expert at all, but I always thought it was interesting that he seemed to be more emotional at the times when it was about him. His family members talking about him, or when he was heard on that FBI tape, obviously confessing. He shows emotion at those times. I didn't see it so much when it was a discussion of the kids. That's a side point. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about it in a second. I want to play more of something that you might have missed. This is defense's closing argument from yesterday. Watch. All right, that's the defense who was advocating for their client, trying to save his life. It didn't work out for them. Kendall, what is your reaction to the defense's closing argument there?
Well, he said the right things. I didn't feel an impact from it. It didn't sort of strike me with some single reason to spare his life. He logically detailed what some of the testimony was, but the much more haunting and enduring with me is just the prosecutor's closing. Of course, he had different facts to deal with, but when he talked about the worst of the worst, when he talked about "Daddy, I love you" from the little girl who was about to be murdered, I'm going to think about those words not just today, but they're going to continue to stay with me for a while. It's extremely powerful.
Yeah, those words are going to stay with everybody for a while, including that jury. Very difficult case for them to sit on. And also, the defense, they tried to say that the mother of these children even wanted to save the life of this man, but at the end of the day, it didn't work out well for them, and we're going to have to see what the next steps are. Kendall, I want you to stand by because we're going to take a break, but when we come back, we're planning on jumping live into the Christopher Vasada trial. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll be right back.